There's a place close to our hearts.
Well, my name is Nwando Achebe, and I am a professor of African history at Michigan State University. I'm a specialist in West African history, and my main area of concentration is women, gender, and sexuality histories. It was almost like a fallback. I originally went to college. My first degree was in theater arts, and I had a background in theater, music, and dance. I was actually, when I was young, part of a folk opera when I was about, I think, 13, 14, and we toured the country with famous ethnomusicologist Dr. Meki Nzewi. So I started at an early age, with performance, and I continued with that during my undergraduate degree, and I did a degree in theater arts, but I also did music and dance. I went to UCLA to study documentary filmmaking. When I was an undergraduate, I didn't like history at all. It was my worst subject, and I think it's because I didn't really have very good history teachers. But as a graduate student, I entered this class of my mentor, the late Professor Boniface Beecher. And all it took was one class. He turned African history, he told African history as a story. And it was a story that I could relate to, and a story that captivated me and made me see myself in history, even though he wasn't talking about me. So he wasn't bogged down about talking about, oh, this happened at this date and that date, and it was a story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so, once I started taking classes with him, I sort of followed him around campus taking classes, and that was the beginning of my love affair with history, is, a good professor teaching, doing what he enjoys, which is to teach history, and that inspiring me as an African student. So that's how I became a historian. Is after my master's, I now decided to do a PhD in African history. I would say that both parents influenced me. As you know, my father, Chinua Achebe, or sometimes I still speak about him in the present, but was an author, a novelist, and he too told stories. These are stories that I grew up on, right? When I was little, my parents would tell us stories, folk tales, every evening when we were, I first went to the US when I was about 2 years old. And every evening we would go to the basement and turn down the lights and light candles to simulate the moonlight and sit in a circle, and my father would tell us stories, these folk tales about Mbe, the tortoise, right, the trickster, and we would sing. So that was the way I was brought up, both with telling us folk tales and also reading to us. So that tradition of storytelling was very, very important in my life. My role models were both my parents. I was brought up in an academic family, a family that values education, a family that values girl education. With my parents, there was no difference between the way they brought up their male children and female. First book, Farmers, Traders, Warriors, and Kings, Female Power and Authority in Northern Igbo Land, 1900 to 1960, actually came, it is out of my dissertation. So it was my PhD dissertation that I revised into a book. With my second book, The Female King of Colonial Nigeria, that project took about 15 years to write, from the beginning to the end in terms of research, because I started on the book as a PhD student in 1995 was the first time I started researching Achebe Wabe's story.
November the 25th, 1995, we're at Achebe Primary School Enomweda, the principal's office.
I decided, okay, since, they're not going to change, present your own story, write your own story. And that's what I did in terms of contributing something to the study of women and gender in Africa, women and gender in Nigeria, women and gender in Igbo land. The fact that in history books that women's voices were not there. It was as I started to read and read more and more on African history and specifically Igbo history that I discovered that women were just not being represented in the histories, and therefore I wanted, like I said before, to see myself in the history. And so it was in my attempt to see myself in history that I decided to work on history, women's history. It was also in an attempt to write a counter-narrative to the little bit that was out there on African women that really portrayed African women as subservient to men, that portrayed African women as beasts of burden who were sold to the highest bidder for their reproductive and productive labor. That's the kind of scholarship that I was consuming and having to read as a graduate student at UCLA when I was studying. It took 5 years to get my book out. And it's not because it took me 5 years to write it. It took me about a year to write. I spent a year in the field, in the Nsukka field, conducting oral interviews. I spent probably about 6 months in the National Archives in Enugu, going through archival materials. I spent 3 months in the Public Record Office in London, which is now called the National Archive in London, going through documents there. I then went to Birmingham, and I spent 3 months in Birmingham going through the church missionary archives at the University of Birmingham. So as you can see in terms of the groundwork that I laid for my first book, it's years. Once you're done with all of that and you submit your book to the publishing house, remember I already had a contract. Because of the kind of press it was the top press for African history in the US. They had a backlog of books that they had already accepted before mine, so mine had to join the queue. And that's why, it came out 5 years. The kind of history I do isn't library research. I can't sit in a library in the US and just read up. No, I go out into the field. I spend months. For my first book, I spent 12 months in the Nsukka field. At that point, my daughter was only 9 months old. I carried my daughter, I was still breastfeeding. We went into the rural areas. I was talking with women. I'm feeding my daughter as I'm interviewing these women. My daughter is playing with the kids of the people that I'm interviewing. I have one of the most supportive husbands. Without his support, I can't, because again, you're talking about all these research trips, right? I go to conferences. Who is the one who's taking care of the house? Who is the one that's taking care of the children? So he's there. He is my rock, and without him, I'm unable to do what I do. We have a partnership. And our home is a partnership, and he's just been a terrific, a marvelous husband. I have one child, 18-year-old, Chinook. As an academic, most academics write for an academic audience, and there tends to be a lot of academic jargon in the writing. Even though I'm an academic, I'm a full professor and all of that, I pride myself in writing in an accessible style. I call myself a people's historian. And the reason I call myself a people's historian is that I won't feel comfortable if the Nsukka people whom have opened up their homes and their lives and their stories to me cannot pick up my book, read it, and understand. then what is it that I'm doing? So I write in a very accessible kind of way, which anybody can pick up and read. When I graduated from UCLA and I was about to turn my dissertation into a book, I asked my father, I said, give me advice about writing. And one thing he told me I will never forget, and I keep it in my heart. He said, the only advice I can give you is not only to keep up what you're doing, keep it up, but he said, never you lose sight of the story that you're trying to tell. Never lose sight of the story. And that's something that I've kept with me, and in all of my writing, I'm not a person that plays around with jargon or too much theory for the sake of theorizing. No. For me, it's about, I'm on a mission, and my mission is to tell the story of women and gender in Igbo land, in Nigeria, and, in extension in Africa. I would love to serve as an encouragement, a mentor for especially female children, young girls, to know that everything is possible. Let nobody tell you that, oh, you are a girl or you're a woman and it's not possible. Everything is possible so far as you put your mind to it. Now, when I say put your mind to it, that's easier said than done, right? The starting point for that is education. We must value girls in our society. Girls, when you value girls in a society, you allow them to have the same kind of education that you give to your boy children. Anyone who wants to contact me, the easiest way to contact me is through my email address. I am not really a social media person, so you're not going to find me on Facebook or Twitter, or I have a Twitter account, but you're not going to find me on Twitter. So the easiest way really to contact me is to send me an email. And my email address is my last name, Achebe, Achebe, at msu.edu. MSU is Michigan State University. So if you send me an email, tell me what it's about, I will certainly respond. I'm open to any invitation, especially if it has to do with girl children, the girl child education, women's rights. That is something that, would be an honor and a privilege to do at any point. I would like to thank from the very, very bottom of my heart all of the people that have come out to support me today, who have come out to learn about what it is that I do, who will hopefully be able to get their hands on my books and read my books. I think those of us that write want to be read. And if we're not read, what is the use of writing? So for me, it's been of utmost importance to be able to present my work to the people on whom the work is based on. And so having all of you support me during this presentation of my 2 books is something that I cannot thank you enough for. So I very, very much thank you from the bottom of my heart.